In several of my videos over the years, I've made comments on how the Italian Navy is underrated, treated as a bit of a joke, as is the rest of the Italian military during the World Wars. That isn't particularly fair for a number of reasons, but for the Navy in particular, because of some ships that defy the trope. There was Espero, of course, the destroyer that took thousands of shells to finally hit and sink. But there was also the topic of today's video, the even smaller torpedo boat Lupo. Despite being quite small and undergunned, this ship would survive multiple bouts with the Royal Navy, each time managing to make her escape, even when shot to ribbons. If you study the war in the Mediterranean, Lupo is a story that should be familiar, simply because of how hard it was for the British to sink her, and for that matter, how Lupo managed to be just about everywhere in her 2 years of war service. She's an interesting case, I think, and all the more so when you look at how small she really was. Lupo was a Spica-class torpedo boat. These were, in classic fashion, destroyers but smaller. In this case, a displacement of 680 tons at the standard load, and only 1,050 tons when fully loaded, on a hull of 82 meters, 269 feet in length, with a beam of 8 meters, 26 feet. Just for comparison, your typical British destroyer would have been around 2,300 to 2,400 tons at their full load, and around 108 meters, 356 feet in length. Lupo's small size would translate to, as noted, light weaponry. She only carried 3 single 100mm 4-inch guns, one on the bow and a super firing pair on the stern, along with a handful of 13.2mm machine guns and 20mm cannon, with 4 torpedoes to round things off, along with depth charges and up to 20 mines. Those torpedoes, for their part, could be carried in varying combinations of single or twin mounts, depending on the ship and the time period. As you could probably guess looking at this, Lupo's great strength was definitely not firepower, but her speed. She was capable of around 34 knots on 19,000 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. Not the speediest ship out there, especially by Italian standards. But she was low, lean, and quick. That was often enough to survive enemy encounters. And it is also where we'll wrap up the design and move on to service history, starting with when she was first laid down at the shipyard in Fiume on December 7th, 1936, with the launch following a little under a year later on November 7th, 1937. Lupo would then be commissioned on February 20th, 1938. Honestly, a pretty fast construction period for peacetime, even when you take into account her small size. Unfortunately, since this is peacetime, finding details on the service is difficult, in English language sources at any rate. The best I've been able to find is that the ship was initially assigned to Sicily, before being reassigned to the Aegean by January 1940. If anyone has good Italian language sources, do let me know. That could be useful for future videos. For the moment, let's shift to where Lupo was in 1940. As noted, The ship was assigned to the Aegean Sea at the start of 1940. More specifically, Lupo was the flagship of the 8th Torpedo Boat Squadron, alongside 3 of her sisters. At the time, they were based out of the island of Rhodes, then an Italian colonial possession. They would still be there on June 10th, 1940, when Italy jumped into the Second World War to get a seat at the apparent victor's table. Of course, that isn't what would happen, but Lupo's crew certainly couldn't have known that. Those men and their ship would be put to use the moment the war started, on convoy escort duty to guard against any potential British strikes on Italian shipping. This was a good idea because the British could and would make a point of striking Italian convoys, but not for the most part in the Aegean. As a result, Lupo would be reassigned again in late 1940 to support operations against Greece. The Italians invaded in October, and after this point, well, the war would certainly come to the Aegean. A war that Lupo would quickly find herself embroiled in, to spectacular result. Under a new captain, Francesco Mibelli, Lupo continued to patrol the Aegean through the end of 1940 and into the early days of 1941. It is here where Lupo began to write her legend, specifically at the end of January 1941, when the torpedo boat departed Rhodes in company with her sister Libra. The pair of torpedo boats were, ostensibly, performing an anti-submarine search near Crete. However, they were also watching for surface shipping, an extension of their prior escort work, now shifting to patrol duty. And on this patrol, they would spot an Allied convoy, AN-14, 8 merchant ships escorted by 5 warships, the old cruiser Calcutta, the newer but still aging destroyer Dainty, the modern destroyer Jaguar, and 2 Flower-class corvettes. This escort would have been more than enough to deal with Lupo and Libra, not even counting the distant cover of the 2 modern cruisers, Ajax and Perth. However, the Italians proved surprisingly aggressive here. They spotted the Allied convoy on January 31st, 1941, whereupon Captain Mibelli would order Libra to distract the British escorts, so Lupo could go in on the attack. This would be a successful tactic. Lupo was able to charge the convoy and get off torpedoes, with at least one hitting the tanker Desmolia, I think. It wasn't enough to sink her, but the tanker did have to be towed to safety, arriving at Suda Bay on February 1st, where she would be beached. As for Lupo, she made off scot-free. No damage to her or Libra. After this, Lupo would spend the next couple months on quieter work, from helping to retake an Aegean island to escorting various convoys. In the former case, Lupo and one of her sisters landed 240 soldiers on the island on February 27, 1941, before bombarding British positions on the docks. In the latter case, well, it's here where we arrive at Lupo's most famous action, the convoy action that bears her name during the Battle of Crete. This came on the night of May 21st, 1941. Now, for some context. The Germans had begun their infamous paratrooper landings on May 20th, 1941. Even as those men were dropped on Crete, the Germans acknowledged the risk of relying on paratroopers alone. So a group of 20 small transports, I use the word transport loosely here as it was mostly fishing boats and the like, were loaded up in Greece. Those would carry around 2,300, O'Hara cites 2,331 mountain troops to Crete. For escorting those men, the Italians lent the services of Lupo. Well, eventually, the convoy departed on May 19th under the escort of another torpedo boat, Silio, which proceeded to damage her propeller 80 miles north of Crete, forcing a withdrawal. Then an antique destroyer, Curetone, was assigned to the escort, with that ship promptly hitting a mine near Athens on May 20th and sinking. Not exactly a great omen. The Italians, presumably frustrated and embarrassed by this point, dispatched a third ship, Lupo. She would locate the undefended transports on May 21st, 30 miles from their destination, where further issues came in confused orders from the German sector commander, Admiral Karl Schuster. This would further delay things and involved a brief attempt to pull back entirely, which, in fairness, was probably the correct move. Either way, it resulted in Lupo's convoy having to sail without air cover in heavy seas. The small little boats could barely manage 2 knots, and unsurprisingly would be spotted by British aircraft. The Royal Navy promptly sent 3 groups to scout for that convoy. Of those, Force D, under Admiral Irving Glennie, would be the one to spot it. A formation that was, arguably, a bit overkill. 3 light cruisers, Dido or Dido, Orion, and Ajax, along with 4 destroyers, Janus, Kimberly, Hasty, and Hereward, with those ships running into Lupo's convoy around 10:30 p.m. on May 21st, 1941. Quite literally, in fact, HMS Janus closed in on what she believed to be Kimberly. It was actually Lupo, with the Italian spotting Janus a few minutes later, at 10:33, when they identified an enemy cruiser within 1,000 meters. Lupo, still under Captain Mimbelli, tried to launch torpedoes. O'Hara cites the ship as using the single tube configuration. Janus, for her part, made a slight course correction and spoiled the Italians' aim. Lupo proceeded to make smoke and sail down the line of British destroyers. She would evade those warships, but not the cruisers. Lupo sighted Dido around 10:35. The British also spotted the torpedo boats, and both sides promptly opened fire. The British with guns, and Lupo with guns and torpedoes. The torpedo boat kept a steady course, crossing the cruiser's bow in the process, only to run headlong into Orion, coming within meters of the British cruiser's stern. Unsurprisingly, Lupo was blazing away at point-blank range by this point, her main battery and 20mm guns firing to starboard. Lupo reported hits, while the British claimed only 20mm shells hitting them, while one of Lupo's torpedoes exploded in Orion's wake, slightly damaging the cruiser. Aboard Lupo, Mimbelli noticed the British firing amongst each other, and took the chance to escape while he could. A wise decision, because his ship had been shot to ribbons. No fewer than 18 shell hits, although only 3 exploded. 2 of the crew were lost and 26 wounded, out of around 110 men. That none of those shells hit Lupo's power plant is something of a miracle, allowing Lupo to make her escape. The same could not be said for the transports. 8 of those were lost, with 800 men tossed into the water. 324 of those would drown. You can't really blame the Italians on this one, I think. Lupo was lucky to survive and could not have hoped to drive the British off. Moreover, she would return later that night to rescue as many survivors as she could. Lupo would then sail off for repairs before returning to the Aegean by October. Captain Mimbelli, now a recipient of the Gold Medal of Military Valor, continued to helm the ship, with Lupo earning the title the luckiest ship in the Italian Navy. You can't say the same for her sister, Altair, which was sunk despite Lupo's efforts to escort her to safety. Specifically on October 20th, when the torpedo boat struck a mine. Lupo took on the surviving crew, but had to cut her tow lines. While in November 1941, Lupo would again charge the British to protect a convoy. This time the Maritza convoy on November 24th. Lupo and Cassiopeia would attempt to protect 2 transports from 4 British warships: Aurora, Penelope, Lance, and Lively. Force K. Lupo would charge Penelope directly around 4 p.m., while Cassiopeia tried to protect the transports. Unfortunately, while the torpedo boats would survive heavy return fire, the transports would not. Lupo was still lucky, but luck can only carry you so far against superior forces. The 2 torpedo boats used a rain squall to make their escape, while the transports were sunk. As 1941 shifted to 1942, Lupo would continue escort duty, until March, when Captain Mimbelli was reassigned to the Black Sea. As if this were a sign, Lupo would be reassigned as well, to guard convoys to Libya, such as on September 2nd, 1942, airstrikes and submarine attacks would sink the transports, while Lupo continued to evade notable damage. Another convoy on September 16th would manage to make it to Libya in spite of more submarine attack. Unfortunately for her, Lupo's luck would run out soon after this. On November 30th, 1942, she left Naples to escort another convoy. This time, when airstrikes came on December 2nd, it would doom Lupo, because one of the merchants was crippled by the air attack. Lupo stayed with the flaming wreck to render aid to the survivors, leaving the ship vulnerable when a British formation showed up to finish the job. The destroyers Jervis, Javelin, Nubian, and Kelvin. Jervis fired star shells before snapping on her searchlights. From only 2,000 yards away, the British opened fire. Their first salvo would shred Lupo's bridge. Further fire raked Lupo from stem to stern. The Italians were caught so completely by surprise they couldn't fire a single shot in return. Within minutes, the lucky destroyer would be lost. O'Hara cites only 12 men surviving of the entire crew. I've also seen a higher number of 29. Either way, Lupo's luck had finally run out. For 2 years, this ship was one of the finest in the Italian Navy. Unfortunately, luck and bravery can only carry you so far against overwhelming odds. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.